Why are Fontaine's characters so good? Well, if you're asking this question, then it means that you believe that Fontaine has great characters. There are tangible changes to the writing philosophy for Fontaine's story relative to previous expansions. Changes that I never even considered back when I was still reviewing Sumeru. This will become more clear once I break down the strategy. Alright, let's go. First, let's provide a little bit of context for this video. Before Fontaine's release, especially during the peak of Sumeru, we had a very large portion of the fanbase calling out the NPC-oriented nature of the story. There were too many instances in the Archon quests and the story quests where the NPC becomes the center of attention. These characters then end up as narrative dead ends, where any effort to improve on them comes at the expense of the playable cast. A major example of this is Kazuha's story quest. His story was hyped up for about 8 months until we actually get there and the main character is an angry sword.
Give your body over to me!
Most fans, I think, are well acquainted with this issue, and seeing as how story quests are permanent, newer players will only have such content to explore for their favorite characters in-game, so their experiences are probably even more NPC-centric than those of us who played the various events. Characters like Albedo, for example, have the vast majority of their content locked behind already expired events. Fontaine so far has gone the opposite route and fixed most of the issues with past story material. Not only are Fontainian characters incredibly deep and loaded with meaningful content, they've also fixed the issue of the NPC's monopoly over the narrative. Gone are the days when the NPCs hog all the spotlight for themselves, and gone are the days where the playable characters remain static actors detached from the plot. And they managed to achieve this in two ways. The first was that they changed their writing philosophy for both NPC and playable characters, and the second was that they largely reduced cases of isolated development. Now, I'm going to take a page out of my middle school English class lessons and use some theory to explain this. Honestly, I feel silly for not doing it sooner. We have the static character, and we have the dynamic character. The static character is one that largely stays the same throughout the course of a story, while the dynamic character is one that undergoes significant change throughout the story. Of course, the dynamic character is the one with far greater development potential than the static character. And typically in traditional stories, the dynamics are usually the main characters, while the statics are side characters. Now, because the nature of Genshin Impact as a gacha game and its heavy marketing of playable characters, it hurts their potential for radical change mid-story. So a part of their solution was just to make most of their playable characters the coolest, prettiest, and most attractive static characters they could possibly make, and delegate the NPCs as the dynamic characters with all the narrative freedom to develop however they need. This isn't necessarily a bad thing per se. There are cases where it has worked out fine. But when that's your go-to strategy for like 70% of all playable characters in Genshin Impact, you end up with NPC impact. So the root of the problem was that the characters employed the system in reverse. The NPCs in Genshin were given a formula of character design that was traditionally used for main characters in simpler stories. Here in Fontaine, however, an effort was made to practically make all the playable characters dynamic. Playing the Archon quests and story quests, you could tell the plan was always to make the character go through a big moment. The journey of Navia, the self-discovery of Neuvillette, the story of Linny. The quests at key points mainly revolve around the conflict of the characters. These characters struggle, but not only do they struggle, they show us to great extent their depth and complexity. Even for Sumeru, which I have tied for the best Archon quest, you could argue that there's only two real dynamic characters, Scaramouche and Nahida. Changes for other characters were either subtle or non-existent. Of course, I do appreciate some of the subtle changes, but casual players might miss out. Of course, in the story quests, it gets even worse sometimes as main characters are occasionally reduced to mere plot devices. We the Traveler meet these characters, and then the playable character becomes a mere tool to explore the NPC's story and conflict. And that leads me to my second point, which are the changes in NPC utilization in Fontaine. I'll keep this one very quick and simple. The NPCs no longer steal spotlight away from the playable characters. In the past, the story would often seem to stop and carve out a dedicated slot just for the NPC's growth. You saw this with Tepe, you saw this with Dunyazad, you saw this with Ramon, and you see this with the majority of NPC-centric story quests. That no longer happens in Fontaine. What happens instead is that NPC development occurs within the flow of the story. Never once did I feel like Malus and Silver stole Navia's spotlight, no matter how much screen time they received. This was also true for Vache. It was true for Valtrin, for Carol, for Coulter. You get the idea. Every single one of these characters, when they get screen time, it's not used just to make themselves look better. It also serves to reflect on the playable character in some way. They either act as a foil, or they expand our perception of the character. Or they present themselves as a question, or an idea, or a sort of criticism that the main character needs to respond to. Gone are the days where you follow Tepe on his journey through the Watatsumi resistance, and it does absolutely nothing for any other character. Gone are the days where you play through Nilu's story quest, and as great as she was in there, she's still just playing support to Inaya's story. One of the other great things about this change is that you end up creating a complete product of these characters from the start. You can play through the Archon quest, and you already receive the best that Navia, Nuvalet, and Farina have to offer. Play through the story quests, and you already receive the best that Risley and Linny have to offer. This is especially valuable for newer players and returning players. The main characters of Fontaine are great right from the start, and we know Genshin has a bad habit of hiding certain character moments behind events. Having the main players in an Archon quest come out lacking has been an issue for nearly all the previous Archon quests. Liyue in particular, I think, had perhaps the weakest showing out of any Archon quest. It's not until the interlude chapters featuring Shenhe and the Chasm, and the various Liyue-centric events where these characters really start to shine. And that is the end of this video. So in summary, first, they finally decided to change the formula and make playable characters the main focus. Under the old formula, most playable characters weren't even essential to the plot of the story. Here in Fontaine, however, these characters are instead the foundation of the story. In all of the quests we're given in Fontaine, the main characters are irreplaceable. The story just does not work without them. Second, NPCs still retain their relevance, but they've taken on complementary roles in Fontaine. They now develop alongside the story and make the main characters better. That is how they managed to turn Fontaine's cast into perhaps the best cast in the game, at least in terms of writing quality. Now, there's a lot of things that you could criticize about Fontaine, but this is perhaps the one thing that they've executed perfectly. If they continue to do this for future regions and story material, Natlan and Snezhnaya could easily surpass Fontaine in quality. So, thanks for watching this video. We finally managed to release 2 videos in a single week. And as always, I'll see you all in the next one.